Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate, and I'm honored to be having with me in the studio for tonight Dr. Ahmed ELLEISSY, the writer and the international consultant in economics and strategic management. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
You're most welcome.
Anytime. Of course, we will be starting with the participation of Egypt, represented by Prime Minister Dr. Mustafa Madbouli in the 38th session of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. How do you see the importance of the participation of Egypt in this year's summit or session, and the main topics that were tackled during the 2 days?
I think the participation is extremely important. It's underscoring the African dimension of the Egyptian diplomacy. So Egypt is indeed a multi-focus country. So we have the Mediterranean acts, we have the Arab acts, we have the Islamic acts, and then the African acts. So it is a very important forum, and Egypt has to be present there. Also, this year's forum tackled a bunch of very interesting topics, and I think the most important topic that it tackled was the equality and how the African continent as a whole is being treated by the rest of the world, and specifically the Western countries, and if we, very simply put, if we were treated fairly. And I think the answer is not really. And then what can be done to solve this, or to put this on the right track? Also, this meeting comes in the context, or at the time of the war in Gaza. And I think it is very important that Egypt participation solicits the support from the African countries, which
Yes.
are 55 countries, and that will be extremely useful whenever we come to a vote in any of the international forums that will have to do or support whichever sort of decisions would be put in front of these forums that has to do with the Gaza case.
Yes, Doctor, of course, we know that most of the policies that are being adopted and discussed during the summits and the sessions of the African Union, with the presence of Egypt, represented by Prime Minister Dr. Mustafa Madbouli, is about unity and development. How do you see the role of Egypt in promoting unity and development of Africa?
It's extremely important. Egypt, we could claim that we are a few steps ahead of our brothers in the rest of the continent.
Yes.
And we have a lot of support and a lot of know-how that we can provide for our brothers in the continent, especially in the sub-Saharan part of the continent. Of course, we cannot forget, and that was mentioned by the Secretary General of the United Nations, who was present, and that also puts more importance on the event. We cannot forget there are two wars ongoing, and two very, very severe wars. One is in the Congo, and the other one is just next door, basically, in our south borders in Sudan.
Yes.
It is extremely sad that we see that the continent, despite that it represents very little from the global GDP, that it represents relatively modest per capita income, has a very, or actually the highest importation of weapons and of ammunition as a continent. Actually, even if there are wars in other parts of the world, the other countries actually can produce their own arms and ammunition, whereas we actually, or the continent, does import it. So obviously, yes. There is a lot of the very limited resources of this continent that are being used actually to destroy the continent itself through conflicts and wars, which is a very, very sad situation. And we need to spin out of that situation and try to, the different countries need to think more towards development and how they could actually improve the life of their own citizens.
Yes, and speaking, Doctor, of the conflicts and the wars that are taking place in Africa, how do you see the role of Egypt in bringing peace and security to Africa in general, and more specifically to Somalia, as it offers to be deploying peacekeeping efforts and peacekeeping missions in Somalia? Of course, we know the tension between Somalia and Ethiopia, especially that the African Union Summit this year is being held in Ethiopia with the issue of Somaliland. How do you see Egypt's approach to the conflict?
Egypt is a very pivotal country in the continent.
Yes.
Obviously, we do play a very important role, one in Sudan, and supporting the legitimate government over there. One, because it's a dimension of our national security, and two, because it is going too far. The Sudanese population is really suffering, whether from malnutrition, whether from basically non-existent medical care. So they're going through a very tough time, and we are supporting or playing a very important role to put things in the right direction. Likewise, we're also contributing to the conflict, and if we think of the conflict actually that's happening between Ethiopia and Somalia, we find it actually quite strange. I mean,
yes,
there is a part of a group that comes and they just actually declared independence in a small piece of land, but it's not about the land, it's about that this land is coastal, so it gives access to Ethiopia, which is a landlocked country,
yes,
to the Red Sea, and they have almost a business deal to almost sell their ports, which is not even theirs, to the Somalian government, to the Ethiopian government,
yes,
despite that Somalia is a sovereign country, is a member of the Arab League of Nations, is a member of the United Nations, and we cannot allow this to happen. So Egypt actually is playing a mediation role, and we are actually present on the ground as part, under the umbrella of the United Nations, as part of the peacekeeping forces in that part of the world.
Doctor, how do you see the bilateral relations between Egypt and the African neighbors, especially under the tenure of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi for the past 10 or 11 years? How have they developed?
They developed a great deal, actually. We've seen the first, if I'm not mistaken, summit between Egypt and Russia, and
yes,
actually the President Sisi played himself personally a very important role to promote and actually give birth to such an event or such a forum, which
yes,
to my knowledge at least was not existent before. We've seen a lot of support that Egypt gave to our neighbors in Libya, whereas with all due respect to Turkey, but they were almost being taken over by Turkey. We've seen the support we have in the case of Somalia, and if we go back to history, that's not that has been actually for a very long time the role that Egypt played with the continent and supporting the independence of most countries, actually, starting from Algeria, Tunisia, and even Libya, from the occupation and the colonization times.
Yes, Doctor, we know, of course, about the importance of economic cooperation between Egypt and Africa. How do you think this has developed, and it has also reflected on the cultural exchanges, since you are a writer as well?
Absolutely. The economy is a very important axe of any bilateral relation between two countries.
Yes.
And we can see very simply that, you know, politics is more and more actually moving towards economy. I think Egypt has played a very pivotal role in developing the economy of the continent. And if we see some indicators, this continent, despite that it's very, very rich,
Yes.
it has been actually abused, and this is the right word to use, abused. There is no other word to express what happened by colonization over centuries.
Yes.
One of the example, and it's a very numerical example and very difficult actually to argue with, and I use it a lot in my lectures.
Yes.
Ghana is the largest producer of gold in Africa, and one of the top 10 producers in the world. It is sitting on about 30 tons of reserve of gold. The UK, which has occupied Ghana for a long time and does not have a single mine of gold, is sitting on some 310 tons of gold in reserve.
Yes.
If we just compare, and these are facts, I mean, nobody can deny or debate these facts. These
Yes.
are facts, they're available, anybody can check them. If we compare how different countries, and that's a very good example, were abused actually by such an event and the colonization time, we can understand why Africa is suffering under huge debt that, mathematically speaking, it's almost out of sight to be able to come out of the endless debt loop that most countries in Africa has been engaged in. So economy is very important. Likewise, also we have the environment and the discussions that took place in the different COPs, starting from Glasgow, then Sharm el-Sheikh, then Dubai. Again, the African continent as a whole contributed very little to the global pollution, yet they are suffering the most by consequences. And the donors who are actually should be picking up the bill for the damage that they caused are actually reluctant to pay their bills in that area, and henceforth the continent itself is suffering. So these are different examples to the long journey the economy or the economies in the continent has to go, and it's a huge challenge actually.
Yes, and speaking of the huge challenges that are facing the African continent, Egypt was leading the African Union a number of years ago. How do you see the role of Egypt in terms of facing the challenges in Africa, and more specifically like terrorism, like the initiative of silencing the guns for violence even in the African continent?
Egypt played a very important role to control terrorism. We all know the story of what was happening even in Sinai, on Egyptian ground.
Yes.
We've seen Egypt playing again a very important role to control the illicit immigration to the north. And the smuggling of all illegal substances or weaponaries or what have you. So again, I think Egypt, and we know the story of Tanzania, where Egypt has contributed tremendously by deploying its know-how on how to build dams in a very, very safe way.
Julius Nyerere.
Yeah.
Yes.
Versus other examples who
Yes.
unfortunately do not look very safe, especially with the recent earthquake at 6 degrees that we had recently. So Egypt has been trying to collect and create unified Africa, had been trying to act as a bridge between the continent and the West, and it has been very, very successful. Again, one of the best examples is the efforts that President Sisi, during his leadership of the African Union, has done with Russia, which is something was a first time and was a pioneering actually exercise that His Excellency has done, and we haven't seen one or something similar since that time. And of course the alignment on the political positions is very important, especially with everything that's happening nowadays and the different debates that are going on regarding the Palestinians and regarding Gaza and the day after and what have you.
Yes, Doctor, as an international consultant in strategic management, of course, we have seen a leap in terms of the infrastructure development that we have had here in the country. How do you see the importance of the bridges, the thousands of kilometers that we have had here under the tenure of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, a new capital, tens of new cities, 5G cities? How do you see the importance of this in terms of economic cooperation for the benefit of Egypt and for the intra-African trade too?
This is part of development and evolution and part of our roadmap as an Egyptian economy to take the country to the next step. I've been lucky, or I had the privilege to visit so many different countries in the region, and specifically on even live and work in many of them in Africa, and many of them, I have to admit, are much richer than Egypt, but I have not seen the evolution of the infrastructure that we have in Egypt. If we really believe that Egypt needs to play a major economic role and be able to have trade, whether inter or intra-Africa, we had to do the initiatives that took place to develop the Egyptian infrastructure, because without this, one, we had a huge waste even internally. If you don't have the routes, if you whether to bring your raw material or to move your finished products, nobody's ever going to come and invest here. And nobody, it's going to be very difficult to trade with you. I think the infrastructure leap that we had in the past few years is not a luxury. It's something that was very much needed for this economy to take a step forward. Unfortunately, it was a bit late. So we had to really run. So people are like, you know, what's going on? Yeah,
kind of shock.
You had a backlog.
Yes.
You had a backlog for almost 30 years. So now we're trying to catch up, which is, again, not very different from the exchange rate. We had, you know, a backlog for years and years, you know, tens of years. And of course, when you come to put it on the right track, so you become competitive, so you can really start to do some exports, the differential and the change time, people like, you know, it raises a lot of eyebrows. But unfortunately, there is no easy way to do it, because you have not done it for so many years, and now with the administration of President Sisi, you're really trying to push things forward, and yes, you'll feel the change, but I think we're definitely on the right track and going in the right direction.
Yes, for the benefit of Egypt and Africa. Doctor, allow me to be going to the other report of the daily debate for tonight, focusing on the African Union development in terms of economy, as the African Financing Stability Mechanism was presented at this summit of the African Union. We'll be having more details in the upcoming report. Stay tuned.
The African Development Bank is set to present a groundbreaking initiative at this year's African Union Summit to address the continent's pressing liquidity needs for debt refinancing. The proposed African Financing Stability Mechanism, created to ensure financial stability and sustainable development across Africa, is expected to be endorsed and adopted by the continent's leaders during the summit. The 38th Ordinary Session of Heads of State and Government is taking place from 15th to 16th of February 2025 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, under the theme Advancing Africa's Development Agenda. Africa remains the only continent without a dedicated regional financial mechanism to mitigate debt refinancing risks. Africa therefore needs a regional safety net to provide affordable debt refinancing liquidity at scale. Since 2010, Africa's public debt has nearly doubled, with many nations increasingly relying on non-concessional and short-term borrowing, leading to widespread debt defaults. The bank estimates Africa's short-term debt retirement or refinancing needs at $10 billion yearly over the next decade. Access to financial markets remains a key challenge for African countries, which often face significantly higher liquidity access premiums compared to other regions. This is due to domestic economic factors and external financial conditions. The push for the AFSM began in 2022 when the African Development Bank proposed idea, leading to a formal mandate from the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government to establish the mechanism. Over the past 2 years, the Bank and the African Union Commission have engaged in extensive research and consultations with our member states. African Development Bank President, who is leading delegation of the bank's senior management team to the summit, presided over the launch of the AFSM, for which he has been a staunch advocate. On the sidelines of the summit, the bank launched 2025 edition of its Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook report on Friday, showing a balance of improved performance of countries and the persistence of risks amid global shocks. Real GDP growth is projected to accelerate to 4.1% in 2025 and 4.4% in 2026, driven by economic reforms, declining inflation, and improved fiscal and debt positions. However, geopolitical tensions, structural weaknesses, climate-related disasters, and prolonged conflicts in regions such as Sahel and the Horn of Africa continue to pose significant challenges.
Welcome back. You're still watching the Daily Debate, and I'm honored to be having with me over the program for tonight Dr. Ahmed ELLEISSY Nasif, the international consultant in economics and strategic management and writer. Thank you very much once again for being with us tonight. In the past report, we have heard about the African financing stability mechanism for the African Union. How important is it to be having a mechanism for financing the challenges, more importantly, in Africa? Because, as you mentioned, we have a lot of financial problems and fiscal problems within the continent.
There is nothing that's more important than this, actually,
yes,
for the future of the continent and the economies. You see, globally, the world is going towards the economic blocks, if you want. We've seen Europe, even despite the huge differential that you have between, for example, Germany and Greece. We've seen them come with the unity and the open borders system that they have.
Yes.
And we need something very similar, because, again, the nature of the African continent actually makes it requires more of a similar system. We're very fragmented. We have about 55 countries, and basically all are dealing in different currencies, or are dealing in different systems. There are between these countries there are like very rigid borders. There is a whole set of laws and agreements signed with different parties. It's like a web, really.
Yes.
And it is a very, very complex economic setup, and that's normal because you don't have a governing body that regulates and orchestrates all what's going on. So it became a bit of patchwork, basically, and it's extremely difficult to have a vision if each of 55 countries is going in a different direction. So it becomes extremely challenging. So we definitely are in severe need for such a governing body in the continent.
Yes, Doctor, the 38th session of the African Union Summit is being held under the title of Justice for Africans and for People with African Descent. In your opinion, what are the main topics, the main criteria that we need to be focusing on for the future to be bringing justice for the Africans and for people with African descent?
I think is that the economies are overwhelmed. The African economies, with almost no exception, are overwhelmed with debt that makes it almost impossible for these countries to focus on their development needs, whether be it social, healthcare, education, what have you, and pay the debts in the same time. And again, as I explained with the Ghana and UK example, this is not a very easy way or easy path for these countries to be able to walk it, especially under the current global systems, if you want. If the debt weight will continue to be as severe and as heavy as it is on these economies, it will be very, very difficult for the African countries to evolve and reach and develop their countries.
Yes, on the other hand, one important topic that was tackled on the sidelines of this summit by Prime Minister Dr. Mustafa Madbouli with the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is the Palestinian cause, and that the Palestinians need to be having their own land on the borders of 1967, June the 4th, with Jerusalem as its capital. How important is it to be talking one time after the other, and at this big stage, the African Union Summit, the 38th session, to be speaking about the rights of the Palestinians by the Egyptian Prime Minister with the Palestinian President, of course?
I think it's a very smart move from His Excellency, the Egyptian Prime Minister. Well, to start with, geographically speaking, Palestine is not in Africa.
Yes.
But having 55 countries present, having the Secretary General of the UN present, it becomes a priority to align and use such a very important forum, especially with the higher representation level, to align the position. 55 countries are more than a quarter of the countries registered in the United Nations.
Yes.
So it's extremely important. We can all, of course, have a separate discussion about the effectiveness and the efficacy of the UN, and that's a separate discussion, but at least within the current systems and the current regulation, to be able to align and share a vision with 55 countries over a period of 2 or 3 days of that of the conference, I think it's a very, very smart move. And I think the UN Secretary General also was on the same page, and he spoke, I heard his speech, he basically spoke about the right of the Palestinians to go back and have their own state in their land, not to be exited because somebody thinks it's a good idea to have a nice beach resort over there.
Yes, Dr. Ahmed ELLEISSY, Nasif, the writer and the international consultant in economics and strategic management. Thank you very much for being with us tonight on the Daily Debate. Anytime. And this brings us to the end of the Daily Debate for tonight. Thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you tomorrow.